știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. костяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 16th of November, 2025, and you join us for the latest edition of the live streams dedicated to the selections from the prison notebooks, the work by Antonio Gramsci, or I should say the collection of works by Antonio Gramsci produced during his long decade imprisoned by the Mussolini regime. Now, the key thing here that we're going to be looking at is the essay on education, which is the second in the book that I'm working from, which is, of course, this one, Gramsci's selection from the prison notebooks. This was, as we covered last week, originally put together by the old Italian Communist Party in the 1950s, and then was published in English later on. So we're going to be looking through this and doing, as we said last week, one essay per week. Now, if you'll just excuse me for a moment, I've realized that I need to soundproof a little bit more because this is a bit echoey. So I'll be back with you in just a moment. By soundproof, I literally meant close the curtains. You'd be amazed at the actual difference that makes. So, going to work through the essay on education and going to take some quotes from that and discuss them. The overall purpose that Gramsci is trying to achieve in this essay is, well, on the surface of it, it's a critique of the educational reforms pushed through in 1923 by the Mussolini government. Now, this was a controversial thing at the time in Italy, and it was an educational reform which was fronted up by Giovanni Gentile, who was Mussolini's chosen intellectual and was the man who wrote like the official doctrines of Italian fascism. He had, that is, Gentile had in his earlier years proclaimed himself for a little while to be a Marxist, though didn't really stick with that very long. He was then sort of went through various different iterations of sort of bourgeois thinking before becoming the ideologist of fascism. And he was later found and justifiably executed by the Italian partisans in 1945 as he stuck with Mussolini right up until the bitter end. Now, the Italian education system that Gentile and Mussolini were looking to carry out reforms to was a system that had been based on the old Piedmontese system from prior to the 1860s. See, in the 1860s, you get the completion of the Risorgimento, the Italian unification, with of course Piedmont providing the monarchy and the governmental system that was to be used in the newly unified Italy. And the education system that was used up until 1923 was based on a piece of legislation that was passed in Piedmont in 1859. So Gentile and others, and this was the reform of the kept pushed for by the fascists, was actually based on an earlier reform by the liberal philosopher Benedetto Croce, who was, of course, critiqued by Gramsci later on in the work that we're going through at the moment. So Gramsci's essay is nominally a response to the Gentile reform. What it is more widely, though, is outlining what an education system should actually do, both under capitalism, of course, and what it should do under communism or under a workers' government, shall we say. So always bear in mind with this, when examining Gramsci's essays, that he's having to write a little bit in code. So what you'll find he does in the essay on education is he writes what is supposed to be a defense of the old Piedmontese system in order to criticize the Gentile reforms. And in doing so, what he's actually doing is he's projecting things onto the old system that either weren't there or that represent like more of a system under communism. So he's pretending that the old Piedmont system was more, pro-worker than it was in order to sneak this through the prison censor. So he's writing in order to look as if he's defending the old system, whereas in actual fact, what he's doing is he's outlining what a communist system should be. And I would argue that Gramsci's views on this were quite close to Makarenko, the legendary Soviet educationalist who was around at the same time in the same time period. So keep an eye out for some points of favorable comparison there. So what I'll do is I'll start off by talking about, in general terms, again, what Gramsci's ultimate aim is. Well, his ultimate aim is he's continuing on with the exploration of what makes an intellectual, basically. Remember, last week we were talking about the specific essay on the intellectuals, when Gramsci talks about what an intellectual should be considered to be, and how the division between the physical labor and the kind of expertise that's required to carry out physical labor, the division between that and the purely sort of, should we say, stereotypically intellectual work, that division needed to be collapsed, and there needed to be an appreciation of the need to make the rounded individual. And this again is a concern that Gramsci comes back to in this, which is that the rounded individual has to be somebody who can, at the very least, think critically. And bear in mind that when Gramsci's writing about this, he's talking about the rounded individual that needs to be present in order that socialism can be built. So the child going through the education system from the ages of 3 or 4 up to the age of 16, 17, 18 at least, the kind of individual that needs to be created is one that can appreciate the necessities and also the virtues of actual physical labor. And this is a thing that actually was done in the Soviet Union right up to near the very end, which is a thing that they tried to do, was that they would send students from the universities, particularly those who weren't doing courses that were based on actual jobs that involved being part of the commodity production process, or jobs that involved construction or anything that involved like large amounts of physical labor. They would send students out for like 6 to 8 weeks at least to participate in giant engineering projects. So this is true even of like people like Sergei Lavrov, the current Russian foreign minister. Like, he was sent in his youth, in like the late 60s, I think, to participate in the building of giant canals in various areas of the Soviet Union, because these mega infrastructure projects went on all the time, and they required an awful lot of labor. And they would send students to do like things like digging, like learning to use basic machinery, that kind of thing, getting some kind of education in the value of physical labor. And this is reflected not only in the Soviet practice. If we go back earlier, this is part of what Gramsci's arguing for, which is that the intellectuals, those who consider themselves intellectuals, like the intellectuals of the mind, need to build an appreciation and an understanding of the expertise that requires the more arduous usage of the body. And the division between those two areas of intellectual activity, the worker intellectual who understands his trade, who understands his how his labors fit into the wider building of socialism, that worker also needs to have the intellectual needs to understand the value of that and respect it and appreciate it. And the worker who's engaged in this physical labor needs to be needs to have an appreciation of the intellectual side of things, so that those who go through schooling under socialism come to know and appreciate and understand both sides of intellectual work. The intellectual work that's dedicated to building expertise as to how to, say, build a canal, construct a road, build a house. All of that, of course, requires, as we covered last week, a significant amount of intellectual work, so that the intellectual of the desk needs to appreciate the intellectual aspects of shall we say, sweating for a living, and the intellectual of the commodity production line of infrastructure building, of all the other different trades, needs to have an appreciation of how to govern, or at the very least, as Gramsci points out in this essay, have an understanding as to how to pose questions to those who do the management. And that's crucial. How many times have you all out there seen people, working class people who are quite intelligent, get what, as my father puts it, blinded by science? How many times have you seen people who are intelligent, working class people who have a good degree of intelligence about them, maybe don't have an arm's load of qualifications, but are intelligent, get essentially browbeaten into silence by a manager who's able to come up with a long-winded piece of pseudoscientific bullshit that sounds really complicated, but in actual fact isn't. But it baffles people just enough that they don't question him. We've all seen this. We've all been in those rooms where that happens, or at least I think most of us have. And one of the points that Gramsci's making is that we need, for the working class to become the ruling class, at the very least, the average worker needs to understand how to construct a question and how to put it to somebody and be able to understand, on at least on a basic level, the answer, and have the confidence to question the officialdom, the so-called experts, and be able to have a decent chance of understanding the response, or at least calling bullshit where bullshit is present, to use a rather blunt piece of terminology there. So that's the challenge. If we want the working class to become the ruling class, then every worker needs to be able to question the experts, the so-called experts, needs to be able to question the specialists. And this, again, was present for a while in the Soviet Union. Like, this is what was attempting to be done by the CPSU in the 1930s, in the period where there was the dictatorship of the proletariat in the USSR. Like, if you read some of the books about this, you'll see that the workers in factories for the first time were actually holding managers and technicians and those who constructed like the production processes, and those who did the time and motion studies, and those who sought to manage the workplace. For a while in the 1930s, these people were subject to control by the working class, and they didn't like that. They didn't like that one bit, a lot of them, which is why it's that layer of managers and technocrats and wannabe technicians who were the supporters of Khrushchev, precisely because that was done for a while. And this is the point. One of the points that Gramsci's working towards here in his essay. It's like, well, how do we construct an education system that will enable every worker that goes through it to be able to hold the desk-bound intellectuals, shall we say, accountable? Because if you don't do that, then you run the risk of repeating the disasters that happened in the Soviet Union. So that's one of the purposes here. He also talks extensively about creating, through education, a fully rounded individual, meaning not just like an individual who thinks of himself purely as an individual or herself purely as an individual, but who understands the dialectical relationship between the individual and the collective. And you can hear the dog barking downstairs because somebody has decided that 11 days after firework night is a good time to set off some bangers. But there you go. So the point I was making here is that there is, and this is what Gramsci is driving at, there is a dialectical relationship between the individual and the collective, between the individual and their class. And this is, of course, decried by liberals all the time, about how communists want to crush the individual under the weight of the dead hand of the collective, etc. This is, of course, not the case. What our view as Marxist-Leninists is the most realistic view, which is that the full development of the individual worker, can only come about under workers' rule, can only start to come about under workers' rule. Why? Well, the education is an absolutely crucial part of this, because it's a person's formative years go up to make their social and psychological makeup, and to fully express the the potential within the individual requires them to be fully aware of their place within the collective. And in the case of when we're looking to build socialism, it's a question of getting the individual to understand that they are part, as a worker, of the ruling class, that they have certain rights as part of being that ruling class, but that comes with a genuine sense of ownership and responsibility. And that's, again, something that Gramsci mentions when it comes to the education system. You need to start that process of actually getting working class people from the earliest days to understand that they are the owners and controllers of a society. How many times have you all heard it from politicians, from teachers, bosses, etc., about how they want younger people to take a sense of responsibility, which is good. It's a good thing to actually take. It's a good thing to develop. But you see, you get these pious lectures from bourgeois figures in a system which gives you responsibility for everything but power over nothing. So you get told if you lose your job, well, it's your responsibility to find a new one. You get told that if you're poor, well, that's your fault. You get told that if you're not earning enough, well, that's your fault. You should go and find a higher paid job. You get told that if you live in a shitty area, well, that's your fault. You've got to earn more and you've got to leave the area. So you're told that everything is your fault, but you have very limited means, if any means at all, if indeed you have any means at all, in terms of an ability to actually change it. So what we want to happen when we're building socialism is we want to have a working class that not only has the knowledge necessary to actually change things, but knows that that change can only be made via collective action, and that the full development of the individual can only come under a system which actually is genuinely the responsibility of all of us to maintain it. Because then if we raise the next 3 or 4 generations under a advancing socialist system to know that they are the masters of this society, and therefore the control of it is their responsibility, and that not only do they have that on a theoretical level, but they have that on a practical level, because they have the knowledge and the confidence to question the officialdom, to question the party, the representatives of the Communist Party, to play their part in the life of the community organization, the trade union, the workplace management system. And all of that starts in the education system. So you need, as Gramsci points out in this, to have the children from the earliest age understand that they are part of this greater collective that is not just their families, even though that's important, they're not just their community, it's not just their workplace, it's the whole collective, as in the nation, working together to actually build something which is bigger and better. And only by understanding that and their role within it can the full development of the individual even start. And that begins at the school level. It begins from the earliest age, like 3 or 4 years old, teaching children that they are responsible for the thriving of each other in school, and also that as they get older, Gramsci covers this, that you want them to take a sense of responsibility for the good running and the good order of the school. And this is a difference in, I would say, in between capitalist discipline and socialist discipline. If you remember, like, your own school days, I mean, I certainly remember mine, like, how was order kept in your school? How were the shall we say, rebellious teens kept in line? With us, like, this is how long ago now? 30 years ago, like when I went into high school, the order was kept basically by fear of discipline. By, like, if you stepped out of line, you got detention after school, you got, or you lost your lunch hour, or you were kept after school for a long time and, like, your parents were informed, or you were suspended, or ultimately you were expelled. and at each stage you would be subject to like sanctions if you stepped out of line. Now, some of the craziest kids just didn't give a fuck and ended up getting expelled. For most of the kids, though, at my school, like telling their parents was enough for them to like cower in fear. So order was kept in my high school, not by us feeling a sense of ownership of the place, not by us feeling that we were getting something out of it, not by us feeling like this was putting us on the path to something, but essentially by punishment. And there was no real sense of collective. It was just we were a random group of individuals who were kept in line by the fear of punishment. That's your discipline under capitalism, under bourgeois rule, both at school and in the workplace. Now, under a workers' state, let's just say under a workers' state that is building socialism, how is order kept? How do we impose discipline? We impose discipline in a different way, and this again starts with education. You impose discipline in a way by getting people to understand that the fate of themselves as an individual is tied to the fate of everybody else in your class, in your school, in your community, and in the wider working class and in the entire nation. The thriving of one is tied to the thriving of all. And again, I remember being at school and they tried periodically to get us to have a sense of collectivity, but it never really worked because it's a very individualistic culture that they tried to push. So when they tried to get us to, bind together periodically, that didn't really work, and they would always just go back to detention, informing your parents, etc. Whereas under workers' rule, what you would get is what you would seek to inculcate in children from the earliest age is the sense that you are working together for a common purpose, and that we have discipline in order to make our work more effective, and that this leads to a better condition of life for you, but also a better condition of life for your wider community. And you need to start inculcating those values from the earliest age. Now, to go through here and pick out a couple of points about from Gramsci's work about education. So I'm going to start off here with a couple of quotes talking about the way in which education systems are under capitalism. So first quote reads as follows, and this is from the start of the essay. Quote reads as follows: "The tendency today is to abolish every type of schooling that is disinterested, i.e. not serving immediate interests, or formative, keeping at most only a small-scale version to serve a tiny elite of ladies and gentlemen who do not have to worry about assuring themselves of a future career. Instead, there is a steady growth of specialized vocational schools in which the pupil's destiny and future activity are determined in advance. A rational solution to the crisis ought to adopt the following lines. First, a common basic education imparting a general humanistic formative culture. This would strike the right balance between development of the capacity for working manually, technically, industrially, and a development of the capacities required for intellectual work. From this type of common schooling, via repeated experiments in vocational orientation, pupils will pass on to one of the specialized schools or to productive work." So, first part of that, he's talking about what he was called like schooling that is disinterested, i.e. not serving immediate interests. So, what do you mean if we flash forward to today and what he in Gramsci's point and how that translates into modern debates over education? There's been under well, it's actually several separate education systems, but under the education systems in perfidious Albion, there's been like a long tendency, so excuse me, push towards the idea of valuing like mathematics and sciences over and above everything else. Certainly this was the case when I was at school. I think it was reinforced by the Blair government afterwards. And in England, certainly, where I grew up, what they what they valued, and this was reinforced by the later educational cutbacks under the Tory Liberal administration. What they valued most of all was like sort of trying to drum in basic literacy and numeracy, which is no bad thing in itself. And later on, saying that they should, push more children into the sciences, etc. Because the orientation of an education system, as we've been talking about when we talk about Gramsci's approach to, well, he doesn't call it the future socialist education system, but that's what he means. We need to see that the education system, of course, is organically linked to the needs of the ruling class. Now, Gramsci's writing at a time when the move to comprehensive education, i.e. education that runs from like the age of 4 or 5 through at least to the age of like 14 or 15 or 16, that was still relatively new. Gramsci grew up, of course, in Sardinia at a time when the Italian education system was in its infancy. And for him, as a child of like many siblings, he had a large family, but as a child who was physically weak, constantly ill, like reading and like brain activity, work involving like reading and stereotypically intellectual activity was his way of advancing like his own capabilities. He was basically disabled, a very short man, a lot of spinal problems. He probably could have had that sorted out very early on these days, but back then it was a real impediment. So he learned early on to really value this sort of national system of education that did grow up in all of the advanced capitalist nations and grew further in the imperialist period, because as he points out, society becomes more and more complicated, work becomes more and more complicated, so the ruling class has a certain need for a higher technological proficiency within the proletariat as the systems of production become more complicated machinery comes in. It becomes a requirement for workers to have basic literacy and numeracy. And you combine that with the social reformers campaigns for greater education, early trade union campaigns for a greater access to education. It comes together to produce like the education reform movements of the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where you see, even in merry old England, the number of children in school start to grow. Marx covers in Capital Volume 1 how slowly the factory owners had to release children for at least a day or half a day of education from like the 1850s onwards. In fact, in some areas, the 1840s onwards. So by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, yes, you still have a lot of children working, but there's at least a move there to get them into some kind of schooling. So by the time Gramsci's writing this in the later 1920s, there are still children who go out straight to work, but it's becoming more and more common that they have to stay in school at least until like 10 or 11 in the 20s and 30s. And by the time you get to the 40s, across most of Europe, it became the norm to keep children in to like at least the age of 15. So like my father left school, what was it, 60? No, it would have been 1962, when he was 15. And he went straight to a job. But comprehensive education in perfidious Albion was expanded to the point where you had to keep children in school until they were like 15 years old, and then they generally went into a job if they chose to leave education. So Gramsci's writing in sort of the early period when this is becoming the norm in Italy, and so he sees the progressive elements to it. Now we fast forward to today, and what you get is along with everything else, so the progressive elements. Of course, it's still good that children learn to read and write, but it becomes increasingly the case that, as with everything else under capitalism, the progressive element degenerates over time. So now, like schools in old perfidious Albion often become just holding tanks, like to keep the children in for a few years and hammer some basic literacy and numeracy into them, and then let them go into whatever crap job awaits them. Now, of course, that reflects where most working class kids will be sent under this system, which is into some low wage crap job pushing a button all day. So in the words of George Carlin, they want you just smart enough to operate the machines and just dumb enough not to realize how you're getting fucked every single day of your life. However, to go back to Gramsci, what he's looking at is how this can be the positive examples of the early capitalist period can be built upon for the in the future period of workers' rule. So also he makes a couple of observations here that I think are quite useful in terms of how the education system produces specialists for different areas of life, because he's also talking about how things become more and more siloed as in the old systems of education. So like prior to like the advent of mass education, one of the things that he draws upon in this essay is like the old system of bourgeois education, which actually he talks about there with how like the disinterested education, i.e. not serving immediate purposes. So I was talking about a minute ago about how the mathematics, sciences, etc. became the thing that was really focused on when I was at school, and that when things get cut from like the state education budget, often it's the artistic side of things. So it's like music, drama, history, things like that. Anything which can be which is not immediately useful to the kind of education that the employers want working class children to have. Now the music and the arts and history and other things which aren't immediately useful for getting a low wage job, of course they are all retained in the private schools, and this is what he's referring to here, and this is the pressure that he operates certainly in the British system, which is, or I should say the English system. The Scottish system's a little bit different, but it's basically the same thing, same pressures at work, which is every time there's a budget crisis, it's always the less important subjects that go. But of course, the private schools, especially the really upper end ones, make sure that they keep all of those in there, because what they are doing, again, is they are training the future rulers and the future administrators, and they actually want them to at least have something of a rounded education. So here I'll just get to a very interesting thing about where he talks. He goes on a couple of interesting digressions in this essay and looks at things like the complications that come in the development of the state and society under capitalism. So this one refers to more politics in the education system itself, but there is an educational part to it. So this quote reads as follows: "It may also be observed that deliberative bodies tend to an ever-increasing extent to distinguish their activity into two organic aspects: into the deliberative activity, which is their essence, and into technical cultural activity, in which the questions upon which they have to take decisions are first examined by experts and analyzed scientifically. The latter activity has already created a whole bureaucratic body with a new structure. For apart from the specialized departments of experts who prepare the technical material for deliberative bodies, a second body of functionaries is created, more or less disinterested volunteers selected variously from industry, from the banks, from finance houses. This is one of the mechanisms by which the career bureaucracy eventually came to control the democratic regimes and parliaments. Now the mechanism is being organically extended and is absorbing into its sphere the great specialists of private enterprise, which thus comes to control both regimes and bureaucracies. What is involved is a necessary organic development which tends to integrate the personnel specialized in the technique of politics with personnel specialized in the concrete problems of administering the essential practical activities of the great and complex national societies of today. Hence, every attempt to exorcise these tendencies from outside produces no other result than moralistic sermons and rhetorical lamentations." So what he's talking about there, well, in essence, he's just described the bourgeois dictatorship. See, what he's talking about there is the creation of like the parliaments that nominally administer things, become more and more superseded by bureaucracies and by think tanks. What he's describing here is the think tanks, personnel selected from industry, banks, and finance houses, who write the policies, which are then implemented, which are then put into the bureaucracy, which are then presented to parliaments, which are then passed by the stuffed dummies in parliaments, and then become policy. That's how the process worked. What he's described there, without using any of the terms, is how the bourgeois dictatorship actually works. And of course, if you're going to be a part of that, then you're usually coming from the in our case, the private or the upper end so-called public schools, which again, the baffling way the English language constructs itself sometimes. That which is referred to in perfidious Albion as a public school is a very, very, very expensive private school. Make sense of that, Americans, if you can. So when he talks about, in the end, like any attempt to exorcise these tendencies from the outside produces no other result than moralistic sermons and rhetorical lamentations. How many times have you heard a politician get up and say, we need to stop this bureaucratic nonsense? And some of them might even on some level mean it. But of course, and again, this proves how much of a Leninist Gramsci was. He's taking on the lessons imparted by Lenin in imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and extending it further. The sheer complexity of the organization of production and the organization of society necessitates a big bureaucratic entity in the state and society to govern things. The state and its extensions become these huge bureaucracies which are required for capitalists to administer their societies, to make sure that things run, to make sure that things are provided which are necessary for the continuation of capitalist production. These are big and complex machines. And of course, every generation, some politician springs up and screams, we got to get rid of all of this. But of course, they never do. At most, what they'll do is privatize it because the function is still required, which is how, like the libertarian snake always eats its own tail, so to speak. He goes on to make an additional point, which I think is worth drawing upon here as well. The traditional type of political leader, Gramsci says, prepared only for formal juridical activities, is becoming anachronistic and represents a danger for the life of the state. The leader must have that minimum of general technical culture which will permit him, if not to create autonomously the correct solution, at least to know how to adjudicate between the solutions put forward by the experts, and hence to choose the correct one from the synthetic viewpoint of political technique. So, what he's talking about there is how the leader in of the states in this modern era that he's writing in can't just be a bureaucrat, can't just be somebody who knows how to do what he calls formal juridical activities like lawmaking, etc. It must actually be, due to the complexity of these societies, somebody who can actually assess the different policies that are presented to him or her and actually adjudicate between the different points of view. And the best bourgeois political leaders actually were those who knew how to do that. These days, none of them know how to do that very well. But then again, that's a symptom of a much, much deeper rot, which is that none of the solutions presented can solve the problems of an imperialist system in rapid, full-scale decline. But what he's observing now is how that the leaders of governments become essentially like chairmen and adjudicators. And again, this would also be true under workers' rule. One of the things that distinguished Stalin from a lot of his comrades and rivals, as it turned out, in the Central Committee of the CPSU was that he had the ability, Lenin had it too, to listen to like very long and complicated reports and find the essence of problems and question people accordingly. You'll read some of Stalin's reports back to the Congress of the CPSU, and you'll find accounts of him questioning various technicians and officials about, methods of production, and why such a place isn't hitting its quota. What is the manager doing to rectify this? You'll see that Stalin had the ability to read and process large amounts of data and ask pertinent questions to those who nominally at least knew more about the subject than he did. And that's something which, due to the size and complexity of any society, will need to be encouraged within workers in order that enough leaders can be produced who have that ability as well. So Gramsci goes on to talk about the things that provide an advantage in terms of education. So he talks about how those who are born into petty bourgeois, or you would call perhaps even like labor aristocracy, although he doesn't use those terms, families that promote literacy, that promote education as a positive good, even if these people aren't particularly well off, they will have an advantage, in these children will, over those who come from families that are still, as Gramsci would put it, like mired in backwardness and superstition. So that he viewed the development of the town, the development of a wider layer of literate and educated workers in the town, as a positive, because it would give their children the opportunity to actually make more of the educational process. Bear in mind, Gramsci is somebody who values the educational process very, very highly due to his own experiences of getting out of like the backwardness and the poverty of his own background. He still wasn't rich, but like he enriched his mind to the point where he could become a writer and a journalist, etc. So he goes on again to talk about the subject of like discipline in the schooling system. So here's another quote that I think is worth reading. So, from the school, Gramsci states, where his studies are subjected to a discipline that is imposed and controlled by authority, the pupil passes onto a phase of study or professional work in which intellectual self-discipline and moral independence are theoretically unlimited. And this happens immediately after the crisis of puberty, when the ardor of the instinctive and elementary passions has not yet resolved its struggle, and the fetters of the character and of moral conscience are in the process of being formed. Moreover, in Italy, where the principle of seminar work is not widespread in the universities, this passage is even more brusque and mechanical. Now, he goes on to talk about the concept of like discipline and conformism in schools, and like how this impacts upon children in their early years. Because one of the things that Gentile was quoted as saying was he was railing against like the atmosphere of conformity that the old education system produced. Because you remember, the one of the things that like a lot of the Italian fascists and the German ones too like to think of themselves, and you see this with like the extremely online fascists today, is that they all love to think of themselves as free thinkers. They all love to think, and one of the things that Gentile comes across as, if you ever read some of his stuff, is like, and Mussolini too, even though Mussolini wasn't much of a writer in his time in government, he mainly got Gentile to do it for him. But you read the thing credited to him, what he comes across as, he's actually more of a sort of anarchist or sort of extreme end of liberalism, banging on about the will, to go Nietzschean, the will to power, banging on about how communism ruled out individual heroism, and essentially like Italian fascism comes across more and more as like sort of extreme end liberalism or almost anarchism, which is appropriate considering Mussolini was an anarchist for a while, and he actually retained the loyalty of a lot of anarchists right through to the end. Like people who'd been in the syndicalist movement with him ended up becoming like enthusiastic fascists. Point about this is, and we're talking about conformism and the breeding a sort of sense of conformity with certain social and societal norms. That need not be something which is actually negative, because one of the points that Gramsci is making throughout this essay is that there are a certain amount of discipline and a certain amount of absorbing large amounts of information and learning almost by rote. A lot of that is necessary to form the solid basis upon which more independent work can be done. And that's the point that he's making here. Like there is, you have to have in the earliest period an element of discipline, an element of like structuring the way in which a student learns, and an element of like in conformity put in place in order that you have a collective, in order that the class and the wider school become a collective who engage in collective endeavors together to better the school, better their community, etc., and learn about the way in which the individual develops in a way that is organically and dialectically intertwined with the community, the wide, or shall we say, in school terms, the school classroom, the rest of their comrades in the school, their town, their region, their country, etc. You have to have that element of collectivity, the sense of the collective imposed early. You have to have the children come to embrace that. And so an element of conformity has to be in there in order that there be the necessary level of discipline and organization imparted to the school students in order that they can later on go on to actually work successfully more independently. It's like playing music, basically. You pick up an instrument and try to improvise with it whilst knowing absolutely nothing. You'll sound like shit, basically. If you spend hours and hours practicing and learning music off by heart, and learning all the different techniques, and learning how to really properly use the instrument, then you can later on start to do your own compositions, start to improvise, start to go off book, shall we say. But without that absolutely solid foundation of learning and absorbing things, then attempts to do independent work without that foundation of like knowledge and self-discipline, that doesn't work. And again, that's something that I think was one of the things that where capitalism has sort of shot itself in the foot with the school system and with wider culture, is that the capitalists desperately want some certain sense of collectivity, but they don't want it on the basis of class. And they certainly want elements of discipline, but they don't want the working class to become too disciplined and too organized. And they promote it like wild, pointless individualism and sort of egotism amongst the younger people. I mean, this was the culture I grew up in the 90s. Like, the things that we were encouraged to indulge in were sort of pointless, petty rebellions. Like, stupid example, but how many of you are familiar with the American high school movies, where the rebels who don't want to learn anything, don't want to do shit, beat the nerds again and again, and this is the kind of like petty revolt that is petty and pointless revolt against authority, which has been promoted by bourgeois culture over the last 60 odd years. It's actually biting them in the arse now, because what they're doing is they're producing like whole generations of alienated or hyper alienated, atomized individuals who don't understand the concept of collective organization at all, even when the capitalists want them to. So they kind of shot themselves in the foot on that one, but that's something for us to discuss in the future. But the point about this is that, and again, this is where like Gramsci, as a Marxist-Leninist, even though that's again something he never called himself, but I think undoubtedly he is, understood that the purpose of education is to give, or one of the purposes of education is to give that solid foundation of discipline, organization, and sense of collective, in order that the students can, when they go on into either the workplace or into further study, carry that with them to be able to give them the confidence to actually do that independent study or do that more complicated work later on. But they have a solid foundation to build off of. And under capitalism, of course, we don't give a lot of solid foundations these days. So this is the point that he's coming to. And the point that he makes in opposition to Jean Tillet's ideas is that the schooling system, and again, he doesn't use the words socialism or workers' rule or anything like that. Schooling system under a future socialist republic, shall we say, needs to actually be something which is holistic. It needs to be organized in such a way as that it both reflects and regenerates the values upon which working class rule should be built, and that this includes things like diet. It includes things like norms of behavior. It includes things like how to treat each other, how to see each other as comrades, brothers and sisters in the struggle, build that sense of collectivity that is sorely lacking under capitalism. They keep trying to impose it again by sticking the butcher's apron in schools and shit like that. But again, that's not going to work. Things are too far gone for that. So he comes towards the end of the essay. There's a couple of quotes that I want to just read here. So first one reads as follows: the multiplication of types of vocational school thus tends to perpetuate traditional social differences. But since within these differences it tends to encourage internal diversification, it gives the impression of a being democratic in tendency. The laborer can become a skilled worker, for instance, the peasant a surveyor or petty agronomist. But democracy by definition cannot mean merely that an unskilled worker can become skilled. It must mean that every citizen can govern and that society places him, even if only abstractly, in a general condition to achieve this. Political democracy tends towards a coincidence of the rulers and the ruled, in the sense of government with the consent of the governed, ensuring for each non-ruler a free training in skills and general technical preparation necessary to that end. But the type of school which is now developing as the school for the people. Now, again, needs a bit of decoding because of the prison censorship regime that Gramsci's laboring under here. What he means by political democracy there, he means like the socialist future, basically, because Gramsci's not a dummy. He knows very well that the bourgeois democracies don't provide what he's talking about there. So the point that he's driving home here is that by definition, where he says cannot mean that merely an unskilled worker can be skilled what he means by democracy there, it means that every citizen can govern, and that society places him, even if only abstractly, in a general condition to achieve this. Meaning that the point of the education system under socialism is to build that rounded individual who can govern, even if they don't go into like some of the specialist areas dedicated to the building of the workers' state and the building of socialism, even if they're, say, working as a bus driver, cleaner, etc., if they're working in construction. But they come out of the education system at the age of, say, 16 or 18 with a certain degree of knowledge and confidence whereby they can slot into, shall we say, a workers' council or a trade union council or a factory committee or a workplace committee. And they, even as somebody who spends most of their time working on something which is unrelated to what you might regard as management or scientific techniques or politics, but they can slot into the system of workers' rule, and they can play their part in it with a degree of confidence that they can, as what Gramsci's talking about, they can do what Gramsci's talking about earlier in the essay, which is when he's talking about what is required of a leader in the modern era. What's required of a leader in the modern era is to be able to take large amounts of information, break them down, understand them, and ask questions about them. That's what we want to get to, which is Gramsci's point, when it comes to the working class as a whole. We want as many workers as is humanly possible to be able to do that on the most basic level, to pose questions to the experts, to understand the answers, or at least know how to interrogate the answers, and to confidently play their role in the organization of the workplace, the community, and the whole nation, that they can slot into and slot out of that as and when required, and do it with confidence. That's what you want from the rounded individual within the workers' state. You want, even if, again, they're not working specifically in state management or, they're not working in government, but they need to come away with from the education system with the basic idea that their development as an individual, or their development as, you know, part of a family, is linked to the development and the betterment of their entire class, and that the betterment of their entire class is the betterment of the nation, because their class is the ruling class. And that's the sense you need to give, and the confidence to, again, play their part in the actual governing of all these different elements within the workers' republic that we aim to build. So he concludes on this point, which I think is a very good way of wrapping this up. So, final quote from Gramsci: "This is why many people think that the difficulty of study conceals some trick which handicaps them. That is, when they do not simply believe that they are stupid by nature. They see the quote unquote gentleman, and for many, especially in the country, gentleman means intellectual, complete speedily and with apparent ease work which costs their sons tears and blood, and they think there is a trick. In the future, these questions may become extremely acute, and it will be necessary to resist the tendency to render easy that which cannot become easy without being distorted. If our aim is to produce a new stratum of intellectuals, including those capable of the highest degree of specialization, from a social group which has not traditionally developed the appropriate attitudes, then we have unprecedented difficulties to overcome." Now, again, this comes back to the point about what is and what isn't intellectual work. And what he's talking about there is the traditional cringe or deference by some workers towards those who are traditionally regarded as intellectuals. So the lawyer, the doctor, the teacher, etc. Those who are in village life, but in southern Italy, regarded as those who are doing the intellectual work, or the writer, for instance. And this goes back to the point from the essay on the intellectuals last week, where the worker looks at these people who can do things like, I don't know. One of the things that I've always found rather easy is understanding legal and government documents. It's partly what I was trained to do. I can look at something like a form that would be baffling to many people, and I can understand it very quickly. What I came to understand later when I was doing volunteer work is that for many people, that sort of bureaucratic nonsense is intimidating to the point where they can't even consider it, and so they need to take it somewhere where it can be made sense of for them. So that kind of thing, that kind of difference between those who are perhaps very proficient in one area of work life, but who are intimidated by what is regarded as traditional intellectual work. And again, what's Gramsci's concern in both essays, it's that barrier needs to be broken down. The stereotypical intellectual needs to have an understanding of the virtues of physical labor and why that is so important. And those engaged in physical labor need to have their confidence developed to the point where they are not intimidated by bureaucratic structures, by bureaucratic processes, etc., by technical stuff. And that's the way in which we need to develop the education system to overcome that barrier, and need to start doing it from the earliest possible age. So, again, a very interesting essay from Gramsci, one that I would, of course, if you've not read it already, I would certainly recommend that you read. And I will be taking questions on this in a Q&A in the future. But I'll just zip through some comments now just to say hello to people. So we've got Ash, who's already in Monday on the other end of the world there. We have Anthony Welch. We have Working Prole Incorporated from Vienna. We have Anthony McKeown from Prague. We have Bruce Albert, Mercury Slim from Los Angeles. We have Man Bear Pig. Apparently, Tucker Carlson interviewed Alex Jones, and there's a need to defend the Soviet Union. Well, it doesn't surprise me. You put two fanatical anti-communists together in a room like that, and well, the end result is probably so stupid it'll make people curious about communism. Hello to Finnish Leica. Hello to Jerry. Hello to Pat in Bristol. Hello to Dingo Ate Me Baby, the man with the greatest name on the internet. Hello to Albert out in the Republic of Croydon. Hello to Comrade Jawad. Hello to Al 666 Tanine. Hello to Sid, going by the name of Meituan Massacre now. Hello to Michael Wicks, Iskra, Alex in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Tim Gray, Baal with Twoes. Don't know what that means. Hello to Davey out there in Wales, and Zukov's Boots in Birmingham, Alan Smith in Georgia. Georgia, that is the United States, not Georgia in the Caucasus. Comrade Dog, maybe we'll make an appearance someday. I'd need to persuade him to come up here and sit on the seat. Right. Let's have a look here. Hello to Walter Keating, Free Poundstein, Char Paul over on Rumble, Earl Coli 5607. Alan says in America, where there are 10 states where it's legal to use PragerU as educational material. Well, fuck me. Alistair Page McGill says Maduro was a bus driver. Indeed, indeed. And Motang says RMP Gramsci. So, got a bit of a limited time tonight, so I'm just going to keep it to an hour. If you have questions, be sure to send them to me at the usual email address. Or you can bring them to the regular Patreon and Substack stream. That'll be taking place tomorrow at 7 p.m. I'll be back with you again on the regular stream on dealing with like the Marxist theories of crisis. So join me again for that. Time and date to be confirmed, because I've got a few other commitments this week which I need to be on top of, but I will keep everybody posted as to when that will occur. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again very soon. So until then, here's some music and moving images for you.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.